Who are we? In a psychological perspective, we tend to associate the idea of ourself with the brain. After all, it is the keeper of our memories. Even John Locke, the father of liberalism, believed that the self is a product of episodic memory, meaning it is based on our recollection of events through our own paradigm. This would imply that our sense of self is tied to whatever experiences we have gone through in life, and that without any memory of said events, we would not have a sense of self. However, researchers argue that upon testing those with retrograde amnesia, they find the self to be more based on the preserved conceptual autobiographical knowledge of oneself, which is to say, our body inherently knows itself. It doesn't need memories as a foundation for identity. But for an individual, we tend to define the self based on our own perception. The self refers to the choices we make in life, the paths we go down, and their consequences. It talks about the person's way of thinking, about their beliefs, traits, and purpose in life. It is a psychological conceptualization of oneself. Although, this may greatly depend on what school of thought is applied: behaviorism, psychoanalysis, cognitivism, or a combination of any from the three. Behaviorism is the approach concerned with observable stimulus response behaviors, and states that all behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment. They believe that internal behavior cannot be determined because we cannot see what happens in a person's mind, and therefore cannot objectively measure it. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, views the self as composed of conscious and unconscious thoughts, and it balances the demands of the pleasure-seeking id and the moral concept of the superego in the practical context of reality through feelings, desires, and memories. Lastly, cognitivism defines the self as an intelligent thinking creature. Through the human ego, personality is the first thing being developed psychologically. It emphasizes on how the information is received, organized, stored, and retrieved by the mind. With this in mind, no pun intended, one can say that the perspective of the self from a psychological standpoint, such as Dr. Albert Bandura's research entitled Toward a Psychology of Human Agency in the 2006 publication of the American Psychologist Society's Perspectives on Psychological Science, proves to be vertical or realistic. Looking at the self as something that does not only depend on what naturally makes the self even more unique and interesting. This is because humans are conscious beings, capable of thought, reason, and language. The self is how a person perceives and interprets events. It also explains why we have the concept of self-esteem and self-efficacy. The difference between these two is that self-esteem tells how much value we place in ourselves, while self-efficacy pertains to the ability of a person's belief to accomplish a task or goal. There is also what we call our locus of control, which refers to how strongly we believe that we have control over the events in our lives. Having an internal locus of control means you believe that all your successes and failures are attributed to your own efforts, while having an external locus of control means that you believe that you are not in control of everything that is going on in your life. There's a short online test that you can take that will help you find out which one you have the most. Well, there has been a gap between the personal understanding of the self and the psychological perspective of it. In fact, the psychological perspective of the self states that the human agency is the capacity of humans to become creative participants in the making of the self. This seems to be a mix of behaviorism and cognitivism. While in personal context, the self is viewed as an essential part of human nature, which makes them different from everyone and everything else. This, on the other hand, takes an essentialistic view or naturalistic school of thought. Therefore, it is apparent that the conceptualization of Bandura's psychological view majorly differs on the thought that the self is not determined by stimulus and response alone, yet it is capable of making decisions and choices along the way. Different perspectives offer us different viewpoints on how we describe the self. But one thing is for certain, it really is all in the mind.